Well, there's been a lot of talk lately, particularly on that debate stage on Thursday night between Biden and Trump about the tax system in this country and who should be taxed at what rate and which of the candidates is going to raise taxes or lower taxes, particularly on two demographics we hear a whole lot about, and that's the ultra or super wealthy people, many of whom favor Donald Trump because of favorable tax breaks that he implemented when he was president and promises that he's made this time around that if he is reelected that he will continue to afford or ensure that wealthy people receive really favorable tax breaks. And then there is Joe Biden. Joe Biden says he's not going to raise taxes on anyone unless you make over $400,000 a year, which in this country makes you amongst the wealthy people, the top 5% of earners in this country. And Joe Biden says that middle class people have enjoyed some of the best tax breaks ever under his administration. And he says if he is reelected, he's going to continue to ensure that the tax system more favorably advantages people in the middle class. Well, today I'm going to be going one on one with a professor of history and African American studies, Professor Andrew Kahrl. He wrote a book called The Black Tax. This book is really about how our current taxation system is unfair to what he says are the very people who critically need its support. According to Professor Kahrl, not only do taxpayers with fewer resources, less wealth and power and land pay more than the well off, but he says they are also forced to fight for their rights within an unjust system that undermines any attempts to improve their position or economic standing. In his new book, just came out this year, The Black Tax, Professor Kahrl reveals the shocking history and ruinous consequences of inequitable and predatory tax laws in the United States. Above all, he exposes the widespread and devastating racial dispossession that occurs based on our U.S. tax system. This is such a timely topic given all of the news around taxation of people of color, all of the conversations we're having on this network and others around reparations and what reparations might look like in this country, particularly at the state level and at the local level and even at the federal level. So I'm super excited to sit down and talk with Professor Andrew Kahrl about all the work that he has done, all the research that he's done, and what he can teach us about race, real estate, U.S. policies in America, how these policies have impacted particularly urban Americans, Black land ownership, and African American history going back to 1865. And remember, this is the history that states like Florida and Texas don't want people to know. This is the history that in Donald Trump's 2025 plan, we won't learn because he wants to eliminate the U.S. Department of Education. So we know if that department gets wiped out at the federal level, we can forget about it in states that are controlled by Republican lawmakers. So we better learn all we can about our history, about our American history and our Black history while we still have a Department of Education and while there are still professors like Professor Kahrl who are speaking truth to power. So when we come forward, Professor Andrew Kahrl is going to educate us about our history, about Black history, about land ownership, and about the U.S. tax system. Thank you so much, Professor Kahrl, for joining us. This is such a timely topic because your book, exposes the history of racist policies that have deprived African Americans of generational wealth, of land, and how the tax system and other housing related, real estate related policies does that. And we're having a national and I'd say local conversations, particularly in states like California, about reparations and what is owed to African Americans and why is there this huge interracial, I should say interracial, but why is there this huge intergenerational, wealth gap? And so often when you have this conversation with folks, the first thing people want to tell us or first thing people say is, well, the people that did that, as if that happened, 100 years ago, are no longer here. And why should we, the people that are here today, pay for the actions of folks, who engaged in this horrific conduct? A senator, well, he's not a senator, he's a state representative, Byron McDonald's from Florida, just made that comment about 2 weeks ago when he was asked about reparations during a campaign stop. So, first, I was just ask you, I guess, what motivated you to write this book? As I said, it seems to be so timely, related to so many of the topics that are in the news today.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on. And I'm really, it's a real pleasure to be able to speak with you about this. And I think, one thing that motivated me to write a book about African Americans' experiences as taxpayers in America was the sense that the public narrative, and certainly what politicians on the right have been saying about who pays taxes and who benefits from public spending, is just flat wrong. And the narrative, and it's been an insidious one that has done a lot of damage over the years in terms of creating these myths about, where tax dollars come from and where the public dollars go. And one of the things that, as a historian, I just continued to find evidence that showed that not only was that not true, in fact, it was the opposite. And that's where my book really intervenes, is looking here at this sort of the actual history of how taxes have worked in America, and specifically how local tax systems have worked.
So is your book focused primarily on property taxes or also income taxes?
So my book is focused specifically on local tax systems. And when we talk about local taxes, you're talking about property taxes. And when you're talking about property taxes, you're talking about housing and real estate. And so, one of the things that my book really sort of shows is how, much of what there's been a public conversation in recent years about the history and legacy of redlining, of housing segregation, and the role that housing has played in fueling wealth inequality in America over the 20th century and still today. Well, my book really shows that it goes even deeper than that, because not only were African Americans being disadvantaged in housing markets, the homes that they owned, the neighborhoods where they lived were devalued because of race, and they were, and because of racism within the real estate industry. But here also, one of the things that my book really shows is how they were also at the same time being overtaxed. And that continues to this day. African American neighborhoods, Black homeowners are continuing to be overtaxed when it comes to the property that they own and the neighborhoods where they live.
And how does that happen? How is it that Black folks whose property may not be as valuable as their white counterparts are being overtaxed?
Yeah. So, I sort of show that this is a problem really as old as African American property ownership itself, that it begins in the 19th century. And one of the sort of key factors here is just how much autonomy and discretion local governments enjoy when it comes to how they assess property and how they spread local tax burdens. So, again, that allows for all kind of mischief to happen, within local tax assessors' offices. But also it's kind of structural in nature, that even if you say, have a system, for the basic sort of fact that, property taxes have been shown to be regressive, meaning that if your property's worth less, it's going to be taxed more. That's, even though that goes against what, the way that the tax should work, that's how it works in practice. Now, if you say take a regressive tax on property, and that African American homes are being devalued because of race, meaning that they're worth less, that means that this regressive tax becomes a racist tax. And that continues to this day. And it's really, the consequences are pretty extreme when you zoom out and look at, the cumulative effects.
Is anyone trying to do anything about this, Professor? I would imagine that this data that you've collected, this research that you've done, these revelations that you've made in this book aren't entirely new. I don't doubt that you've done some original research and you may have some new information, but this notion that Black folks have been paying a disproportionate amount for properties, I would imagine that that's been well known. But yet, I guess the question is, has there been any efforts to do anything about it?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, one of the things that became really evident when I started doing work on this project was how, the silence surrounding African Americans' perspectives and experiences as taxpayers stood in stark contrast to how much African Americans were talking about these problems, dating back to the late 19th century, where they began accumulating land in the South and then were facing, among many challenges, that local tax assessors were overassessing their land, selling it at tax sales under sort of oftentimes fraudulent, circumstances. And today we are seeing, I think, a lot more attention being drawn to this at the local level. So, for instance, in Chicago, this is a city I talk a lot about in the book. There's been a lot more awareness of this problem because it remains ongoing. It is still the case today that that Black neighborhoods on the south and west side of Chicago are being overassessed and overtaxed. And there's been a lot of mobilization to, one, get a new tax assessor in office, which they did in 2017, a reform assessor who's been trying to sort of deal with these problems. But here's the thing, property taxes, because they're so local, you have to fight these battles in community after community to get the type of political change. And ultimately, where my book sort of lands is, one of these require national solutions. And one of the sort of, that we need to actually begin to sort of talk about these local problems, not as local problems, but as a sort of national problem.
And what could be done, I guess, whenever you think about, because this is happening at the local level. So we're talking about hundreds of different local governing bodies. So if someone were going to try to attack this, try to address it, try to remedy this harm, would they literally have to go county by county by county? Because most taxes on property are assessed by like a county tax assessor, right?
Yeah. And I think, that's one of the problems here. And this is something that, is not only do you have to fight these battles, at the local level under the current structure, but also, and this explains in part why these types of discriminatory practices and inequitable outcomes continues, is that even local tax assessors' offices are actually protected from even federal lawsuits. They're sort of shielded from sort of action at the national level. So a lot of this requires real legislative change at the national level that, one, begins to, as I sort of argue toward the end of the book, I mean, one thing we need to do is we need to fund our local governments more at the national level. It's fund our local school districts at the national, because a lot of these problems that I describe in the book, especially today, are kind of downstream effects from the defunding of local governments at the state and federal level. And that leads them into these types of practices that ultimately work to shift the local tax burdens onto the most disadvantaged populations. So one way to address this, again, is to begin to think about why are we sort of funding these critical needs like schools, like streets, sewers, water, all the things, parks, playgrounds, libraries, all the things that local governments provide and that we expect them to provide. Why is this being left to local governments and their local tax bases to provide? And that inherently produces these real inequitable outcomes.
So let's assume under certain administrations that's not going to happen. Is there anything that at the local level can be done to address this? Because what role does the states play? I'm thinking about these super majority Republican legislatures that you have in places like Florida and Tennessee and Texas and other places, Missouri. Even the notion of trying to address these racial disparities seems so far removed from anything that they would even consider.
Yeah, well, I think the first sort of step here is raising awareness of who are these administrators of local tax systems. I mean, in many states these are elected offices, but the public's awareness of who's in those offices and how they're doing their jobs are oftentimes they're sort of oftentimes not that visible in terms of public officials. So demanding accountability, demanding answers to why is this problem continuing is the first step. And those are, again, things that can happen at the local level, and is happening in local communities around the country. And then again, I think sort of going up the chain from there and thinking of ways to begin to fight for this, both in state houses and in the national level.
How do you see this playing into the conversations that we're having in this country at the national and local level around reparations? Because when you start talking about land and dispossession and the taking of land, whether it's through eminent domain, we know so much Black property has been taken from Black people because of eminent domain. We know what happened to Black farmers, you know, the hundreds of millions of acres of farmland that has been taken from Black farmers. How do you see that, you know, the land takings playing into this the bigger conversation we're having about reparations and what your book is about?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, you know, my book, you know, we are familiar with a lot of these things that have happened. My book shows how it happened. And I think that's really critical to then figuring out the most effective ways to first, you know, stop these injustices and then begin to assess the full sort of costs that have been inflicted upon generations of African-American homeowners and landowners. I mean, you know, I estimate in my book that, you know, when we're talking about the effects of overtaxation at the local level, you know, because everyone pays property taxes. You know, if you have a roof over your head at night, you're paying property taxes. Either, you know, if you're a homeowner, you're paying them directly. If you are, you know, a renter, you're paying them indirectly, but you're paying them. And as I sort of calculate, based on the sort of, you know, figures that the back of the envelope figures here, we're talking about upwards of $300 billion that have been extracted from African Americans since emancipation, due simply to the overtaxation or this practice of overtaxing Black neighborhoods and homes and land. Then coupled with that is, and again, this is ongoing, and then coupled that with the other part of my book, which talks about this horribly unjust tax delinquency system that essentially allows for local governments to sell property that is tax delinquent, and in many states sell it to private investors who then are able to, you know, make money off of your debt. And if you don't pay back that debt, then they will take your home and take your land. And this is, you know, as I estimate, I mean, this is one of the, you know, if not the, you know, it's not the sole cause, but it was a significant cause of the massive amount of land that African Americans were dispossessed of in the 20th century. You know, in 1910, African Americans owned 16 million acres of land. By, you know, the end of the 20th century, it was down to, you know, between 2 and 3 million. And tax sales were one of those things that were, you know, just, you know, in county by county, land was slipping out of the hands of African American farmers and families due to, one, having tax bills that were, you know, excessive. And then if you couldn't pay your taxes, then they would sell your home at a tax sale. And there were all these investors who were crowding into these places, eager to scoop up that property in places like Hilton Head, South Carolina, which I write about, which again was the place that African Americans owned extensive amounts of land before its development in the 1950s. And now, you know, there are only a handful of families who still, African American families who still live on Hilton Head Island. So again,
hold that thought. I want to get back to Hilton Head because that's come up a lot in these conversations about reparations as well. Definitely want to figure out where that land, 16 million to 2 million, where is that land and how do we recover it if it's recoverable? Stay with us, KBLA Talk 1580. We're talking about the dispossession of Black folks and land. What is the current state, if you had to estimate or if you know the exact amount of land that Black folks own today, what is that number?
Is one thing I can say is that, you know, the factors that were fueling the loss of land in the 20th century are still unaddressed problems today. There has been some action on some fronts. One in particular, you know, states have been taking actions to address the problem of heirs property, which some of your listeners might be familiar with. This is a problem that has been, you know, disproportionately affecting African American farmers in the South, but also many families living in cities as well, and has made them very vulnerable to predatory investors, and vulnerable to, you know, losing their property and not getting really much in way in return. So, this, again, we're still seeing, especially, whether it be in gentrifying urban neighborhoods or even in places like Hilton Head Island today, where families are struggling to hold on to their property because of a system that oftentimes works to disadvantage them and make it harder to hold on to.
So let's go back to, so we don't know the exact number. Is that what you're saying? Where it's not clear what,
I mean,
how many millions of
we're
acres?
still not close to where we were at the turn of the 20th century. That's for sure. And, again, like there's a lot of factors that are contributing to this, but, and there's been considerable attention to this problem in certain areas, but I think, this is still something that we haven't fully addressed, much less accounted for the scale of loss, which.
So I know you've written a book or written several books about recovering land, or where one is called Free the Beaches. You've written another book, The Land Was Ours, African American Beaches from Jim Crow to the Sun Belt. And I'm sure you're familiar with the Bruce's Beach case out in Manhattan Beach, California, where 4 parcels of prime real estate was returned to the heirs of Charles and Willa Bruce. That happened in during this COVID period, during the Black Lives Matter racial reckoning period. We've not seen that happen very much at all, except right now the California State Legislature is considering a bill that would lift the statute of limitations for those folks who've had their property taken as a result of some kind of racially motivated attack, or more specifically even involving cases with eminent domain. For that would be phenomenal if around the country, if Black families who had property taken from them by eminent domain could go into courts and sue cities and states to recover that land. Do you see that? I mean, that's something that you've come across as a potential way to address the harm that Blacks have suffered as a result of land being taken?
I mean, I certainly commend Los Angeles County for providing a measure of justice to the descendants of the Bruce's family. And I mean, that was long overdue, of course. The problem in some respects is it's hard to scale that out. And really, that doesn't fully capture the disadvantages that African Americans have experienced in housing markets over the 20th century and still today, and the sort of mechanisms of dispossession. I mean, one of the chilling things that my book shows, I think, for anyone reading it, is like much of what was happening was perfectly legal. And it might even be hard to sort of say that the people who were taking this land were motivated by racial hatred or animus. They were just stone cold capitalists looking to make, looking for investment opportunities and seeing a vulnerable population who, because of a variety of circumstances, they could take advantage of and accumulate riches at their expense. And here again, it's like this is.
Let me stop you, Professor.
Yeah,
that may be true, and obviously, we don't ever want to underestimate the power of capitalism. But we know in so many of the eminent domain cases that there were Black neighborhoods that were targeted for the building of roads and bridges and other, sometimes undesirable things like waste facilities, and that Black land was often taken.
Absolutely.
And not paid. Families were not paid at market rate. So those were pretty clearly racially targeted takings.
Absolutely. And I would say, again, like what I would argue is that like the problem goes even deeper than those families who were displaced by eminent domain, by condemnation proceedings, by highways. They certainly deserve justice. But even those who did not lose, I mean, those neighborhoods that were surrounding these areas suffered disinvestment as a result of the practices of where highways were situated, which areas got prioritized by local governments. I mean, that's the other thing I'm showing throughout this book is like the way that local governments have operated in terms of how they distribute services, whether it be not putting water mains in Black neighborhoods, not providing sewerage for African-American homeowners. These are all things that, both devalued the property that African Americans owned, while at the same time enhancing the property values that white Americans enjoyed. I mean, the problem goes so deep that it requires a full-scale reckoning of all these different factors. And eminent domain is just one among many. And I think, my book really is calling attention to this huge problem of tax sales and the way that local governments have utilized this mechanism for collecting late taxes to, exploit and disadvantage, disproportionately African-American homeowners.
So when you talk about the problem the way you do and write about it the way you do in your book, I mean, it seems so enormous. You're right. It's not just eminent domain. I'm working with a family now in Webster Groves, Missouri, a suburb outside of St. Louis. A Black developer was going to build a development. It sold the lots to Black families. The city fathers did not want this Black development, so they changed the zoning. They changed the zoning to make it light industrial, something that would be incompatible with the residential community. It caused the home values to plummet, and only one of the houses was actually built, and there was a family living in that one home that actually went to court to sue for the loss of value to their home by their home being zoned, their neighborhood being zoned light industrial, and by that zoning change alone causing that neighborhood that Black developer had envisioned to never be built.
That's awful.
So yeah, I mean that those stories. I mean, there's so many of those stories. So I guess I start to think about, if you think about the enormity of the problem, does it make any kind of solution just seem elusive? Because whether it's redlining or eminent domain or zoning changes like this, I mean, there's like 20, 30, 40 different ways that Black property has been stolen.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's sort of like, what do they say about, how do you eat an elephant? Like one bite at a time. I think, here is a problem that, again, you begin to sort of, you think about the enormity of these problems. It can almost sometimes be sort of debilitating because it seems like, where do we even begin? But, one thing that my book really aims to call attention to is like these mechanisms. Like we need to sort of understand like what were the processes of dispossession? How does overtaxation happen? What are its effects? And maybe as well begin to think about, what are some avenues to begin to undo this problem and then lead to the next one.
No, you're right. I mean, obviously, any efforts to remedy the harm, any efforts to help Black families regain their property in the way that the Bruce's descendants were able to do in Manhattan Beach is a step in the right direction. When we come forward, more with Professor Andrew Kahrl, Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Virginia. He is a noted scholar on the history of race and inequality in the 20th century. His work focuses on housing and real estate, land use and ownership, and local tax systems. He's out with a new book called The Black Tax, I should say, 150 Years of Theft, Exploitation, and Dispossession in America. I'm sure, Professor Kahrl, you saw the recent decision by the Oklahoma Supreme Court basically dismissing the lawsuit of the remaining two survivors of the Greenwood 1920 massacre where over 300 people were killed and countless numbers of Black businesses were burned to the ground. A whole community of Greenwood, Oklahoma, Tulsa, Oklahoma was destroyed. That's an example. I was just talking to a good friend of mine who happens to be the lawyer for the survivors about that was the second time that lawyers had gone into Tulsa and tried to get restitution, reparations for those survivors. First was in the early 2000s. Case went all the way to the Supreme Court with the esteemed attorneys Johnny Cochran and Charles Ogletree. The Supreme Court says no, statute of limitations had run. This time, Demario Simmons went at it a different route, tried to use the Oklahoma public nuisance statutes to get around that statute issue because there is no statute of limitations on an ongoing public nuisance. But the court said public nuisance statute not applicable. This isn't a public nuisance. What's your thoughts? What are your thoughts about the case in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the way that those survivors, the only two living folks, can't get any redress from the significant destruction of property in that case?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it the fact that there are still survivors, is a reminder here that the racial injustices of the 20th century are not somewhere in the distant past. That these are still things that we are sort of living with today. But also the fact that the courts consistently refuse to want to address this is a reminder that we can't sort of rely upon sort of justice happening. And in fact the system is very much adamantly aligned against really addressing and coming to fully account for the scale of losses. And this is something that we think should remind us of how much sort of vigilance we need in fighting, not just to sort of remind the public continually about something like what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but to begin to kind of sort of connect that to the problems that we're dealing with today.
And so earlier in the show, I mentioned Byron. I think I called him McDonald's. His name is actually Donalds. He is a congressman from Florida. Again, he was at some kind of campaign event, and he was asked about reparations. And he says, I'm going to tell you, I don't believe in reparations. It's not a religion, so I don't even know why somebody needs to believe in it. And then he said, if you're going to talk about reparations today, what you're talking about is taking money from other Americans. You're asking Americans today and in the future to pay that bill. Is it their bill to pay? There is this really false notion articulated by this otherwise you would think smart congressman that somehow reparations is asking people today to pay for something that they somehow have no responsibility for. And in this country, your colleagues, Cornell Brooks at Harvard University, and one of his colleagues wrote a brilliant piece a couple of weeks ago outlining all the ways in which this country pays reparations to farmers, to bankers, to victims of 9/11, to victims of storms and other catastrophes. But seemingly when we get to the question of paying reparations to Black Americans, we get these kind of really not very thoughtful responses and not very accurate responses. Mm-hmm. Because the other side of this is you are reaping the benefits of the racist policy. So you can't say you're not responsible for something that you're benefiting from. That logic doesn't seem to resonate with a lot of folks.
And listen and note here that from that quote from Congressman Donalds, how that the sleight of hand he was using in sort of shifting then the conversation to taking away from other Americans. And this has been a tried and true tactic that I write about in my book on how generations of white Americans, and particularly those in power, have used taxes as this sort of issue to divide people against each other and to kind of obscure who's really benefiting from this system, namely those at the top. And I think this is another instance here where shutting down the conversation before it even begins by simply implying that any reparations is going to have to come directly out of the pockets of every American, which of course is a quick way to sort of build opposition to it, as opposed to maybe thinking about changing our sort of tax system as a whole to have those at the top maybe paying a heavier burden as a whole. And so, I think that this, kind of way in which, we shut down conversations over reparations, over a more just tax system, over public spending and all the things that we need to address in this country, from climate change, down to, poverty, all these things require public solutions. And these are things that anytime you start to have those conversations, someone like, Congressman Donalds comes in and says, oh, well, that's going to take something out of the pockets of the average American. Well, it doesn't have to. In fact, again, there's so much wealth concentrated at the top of the pyramid in this country right now that maybe we should be, looking there to, find why can't we ever have any sort of the things that, we need to do as a country, including, thinking about reparations, which we have a history of doing. We provided reparations to those who Japanese who were interned during World War II. There are numerous instances of reparations being provided in this country. In fact, my colleague at Georgetown University, Georgetown Law Center, Dorothy Brown, who wrote the book The Whiteness of Wealth, another book on how the tax system disadvantages Black Americans. She's been doing work on this very issue right now about this kind of history of reparations for everyone in this country except for Black Americans, perhaps the most deserving of.
And that's the point Cornell Brooks wrote about it too, is that there are so many instances and examples of this country paying reparations, and we don't have folks making the comments like Representative Donald's, well, you're taking something from me. When we pay taxes to support public schools and we don't have children that go to public schools, no one's asking the question about, well, why are my tax dollars going to support public schools? We recognize it's for the greater good, for the benefit of all of our society. And there's so many other programs that we can think of that we are literally paying for with our tax dollars, that we could all make the claim, well, I don't benefit. I don't drive down that street. Why do I care if that street is paved? I mean, you could take that argument to, the most illogical.
Taxes are what we pay to live in a civilized society. I mean, if we don't have, we need to find ways to generate the public's money in order to, provide for the sort of the things that we have come to depend on as, a society. And, then the question is who's paying? And I think, my book shows that historically and still to this day, African Americans have been forced to shoulder a disproportionately heavy load while receiving much less in return of the public spending.
Yeah, I mean, and we could easily just have a paradigm shift to say reparations for Black people whose land was stolen is a priority that should go into a budget, because we know budgets are just that. They're statements of priorities, and the tax dollars that we all pay, there's going to be 2 pennies that go to your local public schools, 2 pennies that go to your roads and bridges, and 2 pennies that go to this reparations fund. There would be nothing that would prevent that from happening other than systemic racism, and other than a belief that Black people, unlike some other demographics, are just quite simply not deserving. So these arguments to suggest that this would be so revolutionary, oh my God, we're going to take something from some other well-deserving American and give it to, implicit in that is some undeserving American. That's all baked into that comment, rather than acknowledging the reality is that we're constantly asking each and every one of us as Americans to pay for things that we may not personally benefit from, but that, as you said, is the price for being in a civilized society. And we recognize that when we do harm to people, or harm is done to them of no fault of their own, like the folks on 9/11 who died because of that terrorist attack. No fault of their own. There was never any question about whether there should be funding made available, and the funding comes from somewhere. It came from whether it was the U.S. government, the state of New York, or some place that funding came from, and we all are a part of creating that funding. So just really disingenuous arguments made by folks like Representative Donalds. But again, we are out of time. Thank you so much, Professor Kahrl. Thank you for your work. Thank you for this new book. Obviously, I'm sure people can find the book, The Black Tax, 150 Years of Theft, Exploitation, Dispossession in America, everywhere books are sold online. I looked it up on Amazon. You can go to Amazon and buy it. You can buy it at Barnes & Noble, buy it where all books are sold. But your work and your voice on these issues are so important. So again, appreciate you spending some time with me today.